everybody. Welcome to the next, this is the faculty lecture series hosted by the Academic Senate, and I am the president of the Cuesta College Academic Senate, and I am delighted to introduce Elena Reynolds today. And do note that there is food over here that Bailey brought, and so, and the food is provided due to a donation from the Associated Students of Cuesta College. And so make sure, if you know a student, you probably know a student, thank them for donating the money for the food. So now I'd like to introduce Elena. So Elena is a native of San Luis Obispo County, excuse me. Elena Turian Reynolds is the grandchild of Armenian genocide survivors. In 2015, on the 100th year anniversary of the genocide, she made a pilgrimage to
Zizar Nagabert,
the official genocide memorial located in Yerevan, Armenia. There, around the eternal flame, she placed a single rose for each family member who was killed. I can't even do this without crying. She holds a bachelor's degree in history and political science from Bob Jones University and a master's degree in history from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She has been teaching history part-time at Cuesta College since 2015. Please welcome Elena.
Thank you so much, Lara, and thank you guys for coming out today. I'm incredibly excited to talk about a subject matter for which I'm greatly passionate, and that is genocide, human rights, and the struggle of survival. I love teaching history. It is my true passion, but I can't think of a greater opportunity than to actually talk to you guys today about something that not only I'm passionate about, but something that is personal relevance for me as the grandchild of genocide survivors. So thank you guys so much for coming today. It's really a treat to have you here. So as you guys can see from the first slide, I've entitled this talk Genocide and the Healing Power of Recognition. And we're going to kind of circle back to this theme at the end of my lecture today on why recognition is so important when it comes to particularly the Armenian genocide. Okay. So to start off today, I'd like to do a little origin of words. Origin of words. What does the word genocide literally mean? Okay, what does the word genocide literally mean? Well, geno comes from the Greek word meaning race, okay, meaning race. And sida or side comes from the Latin meaning literally a person or a substance that kills. Okay, a person or a substance that kills. Sometimes it can also refer to the act of killing as well, okay, the act of killing. So when we put these words together, what can we conclude that genocide actually means? What does the word genocide mean? Well, genocide is the act of killing someone, oftentimes based on their race, based on their ethnicity, based on something they cannot change about themselves. Okay, that's key. Something they cannot change about themselves. Now, typically today when we refer to the word genocide, oops, my mic went off. Typically when we refer to the word genocide, I think my battery might have died. So, I shall project. Typically when we refer to the word genocide today, okay, we're referring to the deliberate mass killing or mass slaughter of a group of individuals. Okay, often it is a racially motivated act. Now, are there other instances in which race isn't the only factor in committing genocide? Absolutely. Okay, there can be religious reasons and motivations. There can be economic or political motivations for genocide as well. Okay, so keep in mind, it's not entirely about race, it's not entirely about ethnicity, but those are certainly motivating factors in genocide. Now, one thing I think it's important for us to look at when we talk about genocide is a legal definition of what genocide is. Okay, the United Nations, okay, or as we call it, the UN, typically refers to this as the legal definition of what constitutes genocide in today's terms. Now, Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention of Punishment of Crime and Genocide, okay, this was passed as a resolution by the United Nations in 1948, outlines specifically what constitutes genocide. Okay, what constitutes genocide? This is key here. Any of the following acts any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Now, they give specific examples of how you would intend to destroy, in whole or in part, a particular group of individuals. You may kill members of the group. You may cause serious bodily harm to the group. Okay, you make their life conditions so difficult that they're not able to live and function anymore, literally bringing about their demise. Maybe you deprive from them natural needed resources. You take away food and water and things that they need for their actual survival. These are all things that can bring about genocide. Preventing births within a group. This is something we certainly see taking place during the Holocaust, where there's forced sterilization of women in particular. And then finally, transferring children of a group to another group, okay, so as that they lose their identity, who they are. They no longer have a sense, in this case, as we're going to talk about today, of being Armenian, okay, being Armenian. So what are some things that the UN looks for when trying to determine if a particular event actually constitutes genocide? These are really key that we hone in here. They look at intergroup relations for a first major category. They're going to look at things like discrimination and patterns of discrimination. They're going to look at human rights violations. So these would be things like tensions over power and economic relations, conflict over land and property, patterns of discrimination in which a particular group may have to register with some sort of special status. Okay, they may have to receive some ID number identifying who they are. They may have to request special permission to participate in certain aspects of society, okay, whether it's social things, political things, etc., economic things. Okay, these are all types of discrimination that we can see, or human rights violations that we can see. Number 2 category, okay, circumstances that affect the capacity to prevent genocide. So what is this category all about? Well, here we see a pattern of impunity, that is allowing people who commit acts of violence against another group to be excused from what they have done. In other words, they are not punished for what they have done. Okay, a pattern of impunity, a lack of accountability for past crimes, forcible removal of weapons from a particular group, okay? Literally everybody rounding up weapons, okay? Leaving them defenseless, unable to protect themselves against their oppressors. Okay, these are some things that constitute the ability to prevent genocide. We also have the presence of illegal arms or armed elements. Okay, typically here we're referring to, again, a link between a state authority being armed, okay, and carrying out acts of violence toward possibly a non-armed group. One specific example I think that fits category 3, number 3 really well, is actually the Rwandan genocide. Okay, for those of you that are not familiar with what happened in Rwanda, we actually see a deliberate, conscientious decision on the part of the Hutus to order machetes, a specific weapon which came from China, and it was the intent of this weapon to be used to mass slaughter the Rwandan Tutsis. Okay? This is one such example, I would say, that really stands out for that particular genocide. Number 4, okay, number 4 category. Motivation of leading actors. Okay, these are typically people that are within the state itself. These are government officials oftentimes. They encourage perhaps national, ethnic, racial division within their territory that they are the leader of. Okay, so as to create animosity and hostility, an us versus them mentality. Okay, this is a very dangerous precedent to set here. This would include propaganda campaigns on the part of leadership to demonize a particular group of people as somehow inferior. Okay, so propaganda, calling them maybe disloyal, things like that. Okay, number 5 category. Circumstances that facilitate the perpetuation of genocide. Okay, these can be sudden or gradual, okay, sudden or gradual, such as the strengthening of a military apparatus or a military force, building up the military itself. Okay, so those are some of the things that constitute that. Now, number 6 is really important, the actual acts that constitute genocidal attacks. Okay, genocidal attacks. These include things like ethnic cleansing, okay, ethnic cleansing, killings, rape, forcible relocation or deportation, deprivation of resources needed for your survival. Okay, so these could be killings, abductions, anything like that, disappearances, torture. All of this falls under the category of genocidal acts. We have 2 more. 7. The UN looks specifically for evidence of intent. Now, this is a very difficult one, okay, because if you have any legal background, you know that proving intent can be hard, okay? Is it a premeditated, as we say, act? Is it a premeditated act? Was it a conscious decision that was made by someone? Okay, what is the intent? Was the intent to destroy in whole or in part a particular group of people? So what are some things they would look at here? Well, they would look at things like hate speech in genocidal campaigns, okay, hate speech. Large-scale armed conflicts, okay, would fall into this category in which maybe there's systematic killing of a particular group of people. Okay, so these would be some things that would fall under intent to destroy in whole or in part. Okay, and I'll expand upon that a little bit more later. And then finally, the last category that the UN looks at is triggering factors. Okay, triggering factors. So these would be military elections, anything that can cause instability or in a region that can then bring about an actual process of genocide occurring. Okay. Now, keep in mind, one thing I want to draw your attention to, you do not have to have all 8 of these factors for the UN to say, yes, it's a genocide. You only have to have 1. That's it. 1. You don't have to have 8. So keep in mind, as we look at the Armenian genocide, I want you guys to be thinking about how this particular event fits any or all of these categories. All right, let's talk about the history of the Armenian peoples in the Ottoman Empire. The history of the Armenian peoples in the Ottoman Empire. Now, for centuries, the great mountain plateau of Anatolia, particularly eastern Anatolia, what is today the eastern part of Turkey, was inhabited by Armenians and Kurds. Now, during the 15th and 16th centuries, this territory became part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, it was brought into the Ottoman Empire. These areas in particular where the Armenians were living in eastern Anatolia had originally been part of the Armenian Empire in its height. Okay, so that's why you have Armenians living in a particular area that now becomes part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, here's the problem. The Armenians are different, okay, from their Ottoman counterparts, okay? They are of a different ethnicity and race. They are certainly of a different religious persuasion. So these things are going to kind of be a problem as we move forward into subsequent centuries. Now, the Turkic peoples residing in the Ottoman Empire, let's talk about them. There are primarily Muslim faction, okay? But there are non-Muslim populations living within the Ottoman Empire, such as the Armenians, okay? Now, if you are a non-Muslim living in the Ottoman Empire, so if you were an Armenian, you would have been called Demis, okay? So this term refers to the non-Muslim populations, okay? The non-Muslim citizens residing in the Ottoman Empire. Now, these non-Muslim groups and Muslim groups are all composed into what we call millets, okay, millets. Millets allowed for separate legal courts. They had their own systems of education. And all of this falls along the lines of your religious beliefs in particular. So you have certain legal and political rights within your millet. Now, in the Ottoman Empire, in particular, we do see how the Muslim majority here afforded some political and legal rights that if you were a non-Muslim, you did not have. Okay, so clearly if you were in the Armenian group, there were certain legal and political rights that were not reserved for you. They were reserved only for the Muslim population. So, for example, you could never, if you were an Armenian living in the Ottoman Empire, you could not disturb the religious practices of Muslims. You couldn't in any way ring church bells or anything like that. You dressed differently. Even the fabrics that you chose, the colors you chose, had to distinguish you as a part of a non-Muslim majority within this region. Okay? So if you violated any of these things, including building your house higher or taller than the Muslim majority, you could face a fine, you could face prison, you could face jail for any of these things, and possibly even death, depending on the grievance, how badly you had done something wrong. Okay? Now, for the most part, the Armenian communities ruled themselves. Okay? They were independent. They did have a great level of autonomy, especially in the early years of the Ottoman Empire. Okay? They were sort of left alone for the most part. But this will change as we move into the 17th and the 18th centuries. Here's why. Armenians are going to become more involved in international trade and commerce. They're going to establish themselves in places like Istanbul and other prominent Ottoman port cities. Very quickly, they're going to rise up financially, monetarily. They're going to become a wealthy class within the Ottoman Empire. And this will create tension between the Armenians and the Turks, primarily because there is envy, there is some jealousy, there's a lack of feeling like these people aren't really us. How is it that they have attained all that they have? They don't deserve that. So we see kind of the seeds of envy and the seeds of jealousy and the seeds of feeling like, how can an inferior people possibly be in the same place or even better off than we are? Now, as the Armenian populations grow to be more prosperous and more wealthy, this is going to create problems. So as we move into the 19th century, the Armenians are going to constantly struggle against the perception that they are really a foreign element residing and living in the Ottoman Empire. They're not going to achieve full acceptance. Now, there are going to be groups of Armenians that are going to want an independent state. They're going to want to be separate from the Ottoman Empire. Okay, but they're not going to be able to achieve this, as we will see. Okay? Now, let's talk about Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Okay, Sultan Abdul Hamid II. He was, at the time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, okay, Abdul Hamid. Now, during this period, the Armenians are going to start kind of rebelling, as it were. There's two revolutionary parties that will form in the late 1800s that will kind of be calling on an independent state. They want more freedom. They want greater equality. They're not able to fully achieve this within the realm of the Ottoman Empire. So many of them are going to call for an independent kind of state to be created. Now, many of the Armenians, most of the Armenians, remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire. They didn't join these revolutionary groups and these revolutionary parties. Maybe out of fear. It's hard to say. But there was a sense that this was not a wise idea. This was not a good idea. They remained loyal to being part of the Ottoman Empire. However, these revolutionary groups and these revolutionary parties that form are going to scare Abdul Hamid. He's going to see this as a direct threat to his own power, his empire, the security of the Ottoman territory. And so what is he going to do? Well, he's going to launch a series of attacks to suppress the unrest, what he deems to be unrest. Abdul Hamid once said that the Armenians are a denigrate community. always servile. He raises taxes on all of the Armenian communities in the Ottoman Empire. But not only does he raise the taxes they owe to the Ottoman Empire itself, he forces the Armenians to pay a tax to the Kurdish populations living nearby. So really, he makes them pay a dual taxation. He also organizes Hamidi, as they were called, regiments. These were primarily made up of Kurdish soldiers, but there were some Ottoman soldiers as well that participated in these. But primarily Kurdish soldiers. And what Abdul Hamid does is he tries to do this you versus them mentality. And he tries to encourage the Kurds to gang up and attack the Armenian people. He uses a reward mechanism for these Hamidi regiments. If the Armenians refuse to pay a tax, for example, you can go and you can physically harm them. As a reward, I will give you land. I will give you money. He bribes them. Now, these attacks are often referred to as the Hamidian massacres. Now, why are they called the Hamidian massacres? In 1894, one particular region, the Sassoon region of Armenians, refused to continue to pay these oppressive taxes. And as a result, Kurdish and Ottoman troops will kill thousands of Armenians just because they refuse to pay this tax. They will burn their villages. Organized massacres are going to take place throughout the Ottoman Empire. Zeytun, Erzurum, Van, many others. Another wave of killing starts the following year, in 1895, when Ottoman authorities' repression of Armenian protests in Istanbul turned into a massacre. Many Armenians would hide during this time. One of the most painful examples, I think, of this is a cathedral in Urfa, where 3,000 Armenians hid so that they would not be killed by Ottoman and Kurdish forces. They burned the entire church with every Armenian inside. These atrocities, carried out by Ottoman and Kurdish forces against the Armenians, killed an estimated 20 to 50,000 Armenians. Just here, in these 2-year period, 20 to 50,000 Armenians. What's the big takeaway from the Hamidian massacres? Genocide is a slowly conscientious decision. It's not typically something that's decided overnight. It is something that starts gradually, little by little. And the Hamidian massacres were, without a doubt, a dress rehearsal for the Armenian genocide to come. Very much a foreshadowing of much darker and sinister events. One historian once said that the persecution of the Armenians was not just a life and death struggle, but an attempt on the part of an old and great empire not willing to die without exerting one last bloody effort to save itself. Izzet Pasha, the architect of Abdul Hamid's Hamidian massacres, believed strongly that the only way to eliminate the problem of the Armenians was to eliminate the Armenians. So as we turn into the 20th century, there's an estimated 2.5 million Armenians residing in the Ottoman Empire, mostly concentrated in 6 major provinces within eastern Anatolia. So what happens next? What is the progression of events? We have the overthrow of Sultan Abdul Hamid. This is really the trigger point that will start the genocide. How so? Abdul Hamid is overthrown by a group often known as the Young Turks. Sometimes they're also referred to as the Committee of Union and Progress, or the CUP. This coalition formed in the Ottoman Empire as a reaction to the very authoritarian regime of Abdul Hamid, which ultimately culminated in Abdul Hamid's overthrow. Now, Abdul Hamid had suspended the constitution in the Ottoman Empire when he became the leader, the ruler, the sultan. And the Young Turks, as their first kind of act in power, are going to restore that constitution. And the Armenian peoples are going to welcome the restoration of the constitution and the promise of elections. They're going to be enthusiastic about this change because they think perhaps it signals a better life for themselves. So initially they are filled with hope and with promise. But after their rise to power, the Young Turks are going to introduce programs that promoted some very key things within the Ottoman Empire, some positive and some negative. They are going to restore the constitution, as I mentioned. This was a positive thing, at least in the minds of many. They're going to promote modernization throughout the empire. And finally, they will turn to Turkish nationalism. And this is really, this third point here is really where things are going to go south for the Armenians residing in the Ottoman Empire. Over time, the ambition of the Young Turks is going to become more militant, less tolerant of non-Turkic peoples, and increasingly suspicious of their Armenian subjects, many of whom they believed were collaborating with foreign powers. Turkish nationalism is going to reign as a major theme for the Young Turks. The Turkish peoples viewed themselves as a ruling nation, a powerful people, and they felt they had to defend their state against any minority that could threaten their power. So as they turn more authoritarian, as they move in the direction of promoting actively Turkish nationalism, the Young Turks are going to start to consolidate their power. Now, two important people that I have to mention in the context of the Armenian genocide. We have Enver Pasha and Talat Pasha. They are going to seize control of the government, and Talat Pasha in particular is important because he's often viewed as the engineer or the architect of the Armenian genocide. Enver Pasha is going to become the Minister of War. Talat Pasha is going to be the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. He will also serve as the Minister of Finance as well as the Minister of the Interior. Now, Talat Pasha, our architect of the genocide, writes in a memorandum in 1915, the year the genocide begins, that the goal of dealing with the Armenian question was a complete and fundamental elimination of this concern. A complete and fundamental elimination. Now, to make matters worse, things are not going well in the Ottoman Empire. they've suffered some pretty significant defeats. The First Balkan War in particular is worth mentioning, 1912 through 1913. The Ottoman Empire suffered a massive loss of territory as a result of the First Balkan War. They lose Greece and Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Romania. All of these areas chased the Turks out of the Balkan region. It's not the first blow to Ottoman territory, nor would it be the last. But it leaves the Ottoman Empire feeling very devastated over such losses, and tensions within the empire are growing. These defeats are going to bring about a desire for revenge. And the Ottomans are going to specifically blame the Balkan Christians in these nations for their defeat. And unfortunately, the Armenian peoples are going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time for this vengeful spirit. Now, following the First Balkan War, the Ottoman Empire is going to get a massive influx of Muslims coming into the Ottoman Empire that are fleeing these Balkan regions, okay? And so, as a result, it's going to increase tensions between the Muslim populations and the Christian populations in the Ottoman Empire, okay? In this case, the Armenians. Now, the Armenians are somewhat fearful. They sort of see the handwriting on the wall. And so they're going to appeal to European powers for the possibility of the Young Turks giving them more freedoms and more rights. Okay, so they are going to try to get European powers to help them. But the Young Turks, okay, or the CUP, they are going to take this as a direct threat. Armenian demands could mean for them the loss of territory. They've already lost a great deal of territory. And so this scares them. They're filled with concern. Now, another thing I have to mention here, I have it as a point up there. During this period of the Young Turks taking control in the Ottoman Empire, we are going to see a buildup of their military. They will bring German military officials into their territory to train and build up their armies. Many of the ideas we think regarding ethnic cleansing and racial superiority were actually brought into the Ottoman Empire by the Germans. Now, where do we go from here? World War I. Okay, World War I. In the summer of 1914, the Ottoman Empire will join World War I as a central power, along with Germany and Austria-Hungary, against the Triple Entente, okay, Britain, France, and Russia. Now, Armenians are kind of straddled between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. We have Armenians living in Russian territory, we have Armenians living in Ottoman territory. And so during the war, the Russians are going to try to recruit Armenians to fight for them. The Ottomans are going to try to recruit Armenians to fight for them. But ultimately, the Ottomans are going to want all of the Armenians, even the Russian Armenians, to fight on their side. But, as we know, as we see, this is not what happens. The Armenian Russians and the Ottoman Armenian subjects are going to remain loyal to their respective empires. But the Young Turks see this as an act of treachery on the part of the Armenian peoples. They feel that they have an exclusive right to all of the Armenians because so many reside in their territory. All of the Armenian population, even the Russian Armenians, should fight with them on their side. So how does the genocide actually formally begin? Well, we have blame shifting or scapegoating. On January 1915, Enver Pasha is going to attempt to push back the Russians out of Ottoman territory. but the Ottomans are going to be badly defeated by Russian forces. Immediately, Enver Pasha and the Young Turk government is going to shift blame to the Armenian peoples for this treachery. They're going to blame the Armenians for this loss in battle. They're going to use the Armenians as a scapegoat for this defeat. Now, one of the leading scholars of the Armenian genocide, Taner Akam, he's actually a Turk, he once said that it was both the CPU's hostility to and mistrust of Christian minorities and its predominant political culture of violence that pushed this group to perpetrate the Armenian genocide. Now, Enver Pasha is so angry at this defeat that he is going to initiate the first phase of the genocide, which begins on April 24th, 1915. Armenian soldiers fighting for the Ottoman Empire are immediately going to be demobilized. They're going to be transferred into labor battalions. The War Ministry, or the Ministry of War, and the individual special organization formed by the CUP are going to be tasked with carrying out deportations of Armenians. My grandparents were among those who suffered from such deportations. My great-grandfather was arrested, and he never returned to his family. All of the Armenians' weapons in their homes were taken away from them by force. Men were typically rounded up first, shipped off or killed, leaving women and children defenseless behind in these villages. One thing that my grandfather, who survived the Armenian genocide, noted, that when these deportations began, the government said they were relocating the Armenians for their own safety because of the war. And yet, the Kurdish populations and the Turkish populations living in nearby villages were not relocated. Just the Armenians. CUP's goal was ultimately to reduce and eliminate the Armenian people through looting, forcible seizure of property, disarming the Armenian people, and systematic murders by Ottoman troops. Now, the Young Turk government is going to establish a number of committees that regularly meant to review the confiscation of Armenian land and property, as well as their mistreatment. Mass killings begin in Armenian villages, particularly near the Russian border. Now, on April 24th, 1915, Talat Pasha is going to kick the genocide off by issuing an arrest warrant for 235 Armenian intellectuals and politicians living in Istanbul. Over the next several weeks, more and more arrests of Armenians throughout Istanbul will occur. They will be systematically killed. Some will die in police custody, but the vast majority are publicly executed. The Young Turks will also organize gangs, military gangs, soldiers. They will train them and send them out into Armenian villages, where, as I said, they would round up the men typically first and kill them, leaving the women and children defenseless. Now, when they came to my grandfather's village in particular, they were told to take everything that they could with them, that they could carry, and that they were going to be relocated. But this was not the case, and I will come back to that in a moment. Now, the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during this time, Henry Morgenthau, recounted witnessing these events. He said squads of 50 to 100 men would be taken. They would be bound together in groups of 4 and marched out to secluded areas from their village. Suddenly, the sound of rifle shots would fill the air, and Turkish soldiers who had been tasked with escorting these individuals returned without them. Morgenthau also documents how many of these victims were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. If that doesn't sound like the Holocaust, I don't know what does. So again, by rounding up the men first, killing as many of them off as possible, you leave women and children in villages defenseless. Now, throughout the summer and the autumn of 1915, Armenian civilians will be removed from their homes and they will be marched into valleys and mountainous regions within eastern Anatolia. Many will starve to death. Many women will be raped and murdered. A number of journalists in the Ottoman Empire during this time recounted these events and recorded them. The New York Times, in fact, has the Armenian genocide in full publication, the events. If you're ever interested in reading that, you can go back to their archives. They have documented the entire genocide taking place, written by journalists on the ground who are witnessing these events. Missionaries in the region will also document what they see. Henry Morgenthau, the American ambassador, will send reports home about the death marches and the killing fields. So by the time we get to 1917, the Armenian problem had been almost nearly resolved. Now let's look at the issue of intent, because this is something that's key to have if we have indeed experienced a genocide. Intent. Now the Young Turks, the CUP's Central Committee, deliberately made the decision in favor of genocide. We have documentation in which the Central Committee says, and I quote, "The massacre and eradication of Armenians was the result of a decision made by the Central Committee of the Committee of Union and Progress. And the decisions made by the Central Committee came after long, in-depth discussion to settle," that's a key word, to settle the Eastern question. Perhaps the most damning document, though, of all, that reveals the real intent behind this decision to eradicate the Armenians came from the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire himself, the head of the Ministry of Interior, Talat Pasha. He wrote on May 26, 1915, just a month after the genocide had formally begun, that deportations needed to take place so that the Armenian question is, and I quote, "brought to an end in a comprehensive and absolute way." A comprehensive and absolute way. Now, the German consul general in Istanbul at the time, Johann Mottenmann, he also recounted the events of the genocide. He explained that he had spoken to specifically the Istanbul director of police, who stated that it cannot be explained by military exigencies or military necessity. In other words, the massacre cannot be explained by military necessity. We are talking about the elimination of the Armenians. Now, the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, was so horrified by what he was witnessing and how the international community was doing nothing. And he records specifically that his failure to stop the destruction of the Armenians had made Turkey for him a place of horror. He said, "I found it intolerable, my further daily association with men who, however gracious and accommodating and good-natured they might have been to the American ambassador, were still reeking with the blood of nearly 1 million human beings." This here is a map of major massacre sites throughout the Ottoman Empire. It charts as well the death march routes that many Armenians would be put on. There was no relocation. The goal was death. It was the total and complete elimination. Now, ever since the genocide, the Turkish government has stated that the Armenians were victims of wartime conditions, of disease, of isolated violence. There was no intention to kill them as a people. However, we have written proof by the perpetrators themselves in their own words of what their intent really was. If the Armenians really were a danger to the Ottoman military, if they needed to be distanced from war zones, then why were they deported from areas far removed from war zones? This is a mass slaughter. Now, the property that was forcibly taken from Armenian families who were being relocated is a very key component, I think, in determining intent. Now, when the Armenians were forcibly removed from their homes, Muslim settlers pouring into the Ottoman Empire post-Balkan War were given these properties, these homes of the Armenians to live in, to reside in. Official Turkish reports quote at length that the owners of the Armenian property, now under control of the state, must be compensated. And yet, no explanations of how the property should be returned to the Armenians, and no mention is made of the Armenians ever returning. Not to mention, there is not a single piece of documentary evidence that exists to show that compensation was actually paid to deportees. So if the intent on the Ottoman government was relocation, was resettlement, then proof of payment to these people who were being resettled should exist. And it does not. Let's look at specific acts of genocide. Specific acts of genocide. How was the Armenian genocide carried out? We have oppression of the villages. Remember, during the Hamidian massacres, we see tax collection used as a pretext to killing the Armenians. We also have forced conscriptions, confiscation of property, etc. We have assaults and massacres in border villages and elsewhere. These were perpetrated by the special organization created by the Young Turks. The goal was to demobilize Armenian troops in the Ottoman military, to disarm the men, all of which are rounded up first, and to systematically kill the women and children remaining. Many of them are raped in the process. Disarming the Armenian population. Disarming the Armenian population. And finally, strategic deportations. So let's take a look at these briefly, very quickly, each category. How does this fit into the UN framework for declaring genocide? Number 1 fits the category of number 1 and number 4. Category number 1 is intergroup relations and patterns of discrimination. Category 4 is encouraging division between national, racial, ethnical, and religious groups, all of which happened to the Armenian peoples. Number 2 fulfills the category, again, of number 1, intergroup relations and patterns of discrimination, and category 2, circumstances that affect the capacity to prevent genocide, such as disarming an entire population. Number 3 fits category 2 as well. And number 4, finally, constitutes category 6, genocidal acts, depriving individuals of their basic necessities for their survival, marching the Armenian people into the Syrian deserts where they had no hope of survival, depriving them of food and water and even clothing. So why did denial by the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide set such a dangerous precedent? This is why. Because it empowered and it emboldened future leaders such as Adolf Hitler to carry out similar mass murder and really believe he could get away with it. In a speech Hitler gave in 1939, just 1 week before invading Poland, he said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Now, I briefly want to show you guys some photos. Those of you who might be bothered by it, don't look. I'll let you know when we're done. Okay, these are some photographic evidence of the genocide actually being documented. I will go through them quickly. We have men and women being hung. We have mass graves being uncovered later, as you can see, filled with the bones and the skulls of the Armenians. Again, being hung, being crucified. We have children starving to death, skin and bones. We have forcible deportations. Yes, we have photos of deportations taking place. And we have mass graves. Mass graves. So what is the answer in all of this? How does recognition heal? Well, first of all, what is recognition? Recognition is the formal acknowledgement of something's existence, validity, or legality. And why is recognition so important when we talk about the Armenian genocide? Because acknowledgement brings healing. Just as denial brings suffering, not only to those who died and to their descendants, acknowledgement brings healing. Acknowledgement in many ways serves as that first step to restoration and the normalization of relations between formerly hostile parties. The past is sometimes inconvenient, and it's difficult for groups to come to terms with an evil deed they may have done, with an evil they may have perpetrated on another group. But the best way for perpetrators and their descendants, as well as survivors and their descendants, to heal is through formal acknowledgement of what has happened. Not to sweep it under the rug and say it was not genocide. These people were casualties of war. That is an insult to the survivors. And it is a lie. It is a lie when there is documentation to prove genocide. I think most importantly, what recognition does, formal recognition, it brings closure when there is admission. Closure is so important. A lack of closure, a lack of admission, is to continue genocide over and over and over. It is to invalidate an entire people, their history, their struggles, their existence. It is to discredit and undermine at their core who they are. And it serves to re-inflict a wound already deep. So can formal reparations ever be made in the Armenian genocide? My answer would be no. Too many generations have passed. Too many generations have passed. But recognition, formal acknowledgement that this was indeed a genocide. These people were deliberately and systematically killed because they did not fit the narrative of Turkish nationalism and what the Ottoman Empire wanted to look like. Recognition and admission, I think, is enough. Because ultimately it is the first step for both sides to heal. And wouldn't it be an amazing, a tremendous day if Turkey and Armenia could have a real border and a real relationship, one that is not defined by this horrific event? Wouldn't that be a wonderful day? So my encouragement to all of you that came here today is simply this, especially for those of you that teach history. It is so important to teach the Armenian genocide, the very first genocide of the 20th century that claimed the lives of 1.5 million Armenians because it served as a dangerous precedent for a much worse genocide to come in the Holocaust. When we know the past, hopefully, we will not continue to repeat it. But when we don't know, when we are ignorant, when we are ill-informed, this is how genocide continues over and over again. In closing, as much as I would have loved to have shared my own grandparents' story in this lecture, I felt strongly that it was not particularly professional to bring in too much of a personal component. I wanted to approach it from an academic standpoint. But I want to dedicate this lecture to my grandparents, to the 1.5 million Armenians killed in the Armenian genocide, to my grandparents Bahram Turian and Adelina Amiralian, and all the other survivors of the genocide who suffered so greatly. My grandfather lost his entire family. He's the only one that survived. My grandmother was more fortunate. She and her brothers and her mother managed to escape and survive. But this lecture is also about the survivors, my mother, myself, those of us that still so wish to see acknowledgement and restoration take place, formal recognition that what happened to these people was genocide. Thank you.